Name. Now. Hush. It's true. He calls himself Hush.
He said it! He said it!
I needed a new persona. My true identity had to be kept hush-hush.
Oh, that's why they call it that.
These videos are not for children. If you're a children, then piss off.
Hey there, it's me, your least favorite YouTuber, the Infuso. And I've talked a lot about the DC animated movie universe. And I've also talked a bit about the Hush storyline in comics. And that's why today, I'm here to talk about the Batman Hush adaptation that's linked to that line of films. So with that being said, let's just get right into it. So I want to start off by saying Batman Hush does feel a bit different from the other Batman films it's attached to. Unlike the others, this doesn't seem to add to the overall overarching narrative. Rather than a fluid continuation, this feels like a separate standalone adventure that just so happens to take place in that universe. Which I suppose makes sense because the last three movies felt like they started and completed a story. So I guess anything after that would just have to be its own thing. There's nothing wrong with that per se, I guess it was kind of inevitable. But given the fact that this was the way this set of films ended, it makes it stand out from the bunch that much more. I've already spoken on the channel before about my problems with the original Hush story. But in my opinion, the movie suffers from a lot of the same problems as the original story. Because this was originally a comic book series and the series wanted to stretch its story out for as long as possible, the arc took a lot of unnecessary turns along the way, further convoluting the plot and bringing in more established names and faces to play minor and major parts that, for the most part, didn't really serve that much of a purpose. Despite attempting to condense the story, they still kept a lot of the elements that muddled that story up to begin with. While I think the movie did benefit from some cutting down of the original source, there was still more that probably should have ended up on the chopping block as well. And I think this story also suffers a little bit from not being able to play certain events out as they were done in the original comic. Major plot points are sped through, and at times it feels like I'm watching the plot on fast forward. Batman's traumatic injury is just over and done with immediately. It makes you wonder why they would even bother to include that into the story. So as an adaptation, I think it leaves a little bit to be desired. The idea that Riddler, this mastermind, this super genius, was able to determine the true identity of the Caped Crusader due to a skinny dip in a Lazarus pit has really always been a creative goof. Had the Riddler figured out that Batman is Bruce Wayne on his own, that information gain would have felt earned and legitimized the Riddler as a worthy foe, as well as Batman's intellectual peer. But instead they went the ancient magic by chance route, and it doesn't really do anything for the character. It adds nothing to his credibility as a true foe to the Bat, and it doesn't make him feel like a legitimate threat to Batman physically or intellectually. Ultimately, he's just a guy who got lucky due to Deus Ex Machina. When the movie's trying to be a faithful adaptation, it sucks because it's a faithful adaptation. But then when the movie sways away from the original story, they're creating entirely separate issues. They change Hush's identity, which kinda works, to be fair. I always said that Thomas Elliot randomly being introduced into the lore was kind of a
dead giveaway. Dead giveaway.
Charles, thank you very much.
Dead giveaway.
New villain shows up in town around the same time that Bruce's best friend shows up in town. Gee, I wonder who this villain is. So I think turning it around and using the character as a total red herring is actually a pretty clever move. And they cut straight to the chase by revealing that the Riddler is in fact Hush. And I think that's good in some ways because, again, you're cutting straight to the point. Riddler was ultimately the end reveal behind Hush, except he was working with Hush. This movie just cut out the middleman and said, the Riddler is Hush. That's not a bad plot point, until you start thinking about it. You see, the end reveal is that this new villain is really just an old villain with a makeover. What even is the point? I also have a hard time believing that the Riddler would be able to not tell anyone who he is. I'm not doubting his abilities to put together such convoluted schemes. That's spot on. That makes sense for the character. I buy that. But the idea that the man who can't help but leave clues behind, tying his crime sprees back to himself, instead of just being stealthy and walking free, would be able to commit these crimes and not seek credit and attention for it? Yeah, I don't know. I don't think so. He needs to be acknowledged. He needs to be validated for his genius. I can't imagine him not wanting to sign his initials on his latest proverbial piece of art. And if the intent was to have the Riddler be seen as a campy doofus, It's both a pretty bad interpretation of that character, but also a pretty poor choice to feature him as the movie's main villain. What's even worse is that the Riddler's first and only appearance in the series doesn't showcase him as the Riddler, but instead makes him Hush. And because of this end reveal really lacks all sting. We don't even get to know him as a character before he's revealed to be the big bad. So it's almost like there's nothing to this revelation. The shock is that he's not Thomas Elliot like he is in the comics. And the only way you would know that is if you were familiar with that story. I kind of feel like this movie expects its audience to have an understanding or knowledge of the material going in, and that's not exactly the best way to tell a story. If you have to go into a movie knowing what the original comic book was like to understand the movie, then you have failed at making a movie. His reveal adds nothing. It's just kind of like, oh hey, there's that guy that we don't know but we've seen once. I just don't think playing as a pawn in his own overall scheme while he was shrouded in mystery would really be on the table for the Riddler. And in that same vein, this is the Joker's first appearance in this continuity. And it doesn't showcase him as the clown prince of crime, but rather an innocent victim in Hush's scheme. And yeah, I get it. I know that was his place in the original story as well. But first off, that was a mistake. And secondly, maybe you didn't hear me, this is the Joker's only appearance in any of these Batman movies. What a way to portray Batman's greatest foe. In terms of Damian, his cameo was hilarious. But after seeing how well he was utilized and how important and integral he was to the previous movies, it's a bit jarring to see him take such a back seat. I guess it's probably because Damian wasn't around for the original story, so he didn't have a place set in it, but you could have done something to incorporate him in. I mean, we're talking about the character whose back these movies were made off of. Wait a second. Did I just defend Damian Wayne? I don't even know who I am anymore. There's one thing I'm really starting to dislike with these movies, and it's the random time jumps to fast forward through character arcs and relationships. The last movie pretty much drops Batwoman into the plot as a previously established character, even though she was not. And this movie does the same thing with Catwoman. Having Batman met Catwoman and started a relationship with her sometime in between movies. And I understand why this is done, because these are all stories that were previously made before that they're trying to fit into their own universe. So they're trying to get the timeline to catch up to the narrative. But it sort of feels cheap when this happens, especially when it happens as often as it does. I'm not knocking it, I get it, I'm just stating that I'm not a fan of it. They sort of do the same thing with the big reveal of who Hush is as well. But because of these jumps to random points in the timeline, sometimes these movies will set something up, and ultimately it will never really pay off. Batgirl was revealed at the tail end of the last Batman movie, and in here she has absolutely nothing to do. The character literally shows up for one scene before being completely forgotten about by the plot. She was just there to have a tiff with Catwoman over Bruce's nearly dead body, and then just like that, poof, she's gone. She showed up that one time, and then she showed up again, and then she just stopped showing up. And that's it. That is all the time we're afforded with Batgirl. There's never really a reason given for her sudden disappearance anyway. The story just stopped caring about her. And that's if it ever did care in the first place. But then again, some of the villains in this canon get that very same treatment. Here 1 minute, gone the next. I also find this movie to be a little bit of a weird follow-up to the last couple movies with the story, mostly for reasons I've already expressed, but also because this is yet another Batman story where Bruce gets incapacitated. Look, I like these movies, but at times it feels like these movies don't necessarily like Batman. I joke. But on a serious note, The Dark Knight has never taken so many L's in all of his days. Now don't get me wrong, this movie isn't all bad. There are a lot of elements that I really like about it. Like the previous films, I think the dialogue and interactions are well written. I find all of these characters to be accurate portrayals and fairly entertaining. And even a lot of the new additions to this universe kinda work here. I like how they put the Batman and Catwoman romance together. They complement each other very well, just as you'd expect and hope to see in a relationship between these two. They're a good team both in and out of costume. And it's nice to see this Batman flirt with the idea of a normal life with the woman he loves. But unfortunately, it doesn't pan out that way for our dear Dark Knight. The movie does a great job of showing us why these two characters work together, but they also end up showing why they wouldn't actually work together. There's a lot of love there. These two are so alike, and yet it's their differences that make this an unworkable situation. There's definitely love there, but they have different moral compasses and codes, different goals and motivations. They're the same in so many ways, but what ends up splitting them apart is where they're different. And yet, despite this, when they part ways, you get the feeling that they're not saying goodbye, but instead saying goodbye for now. It's the sad ending that this story was always going to build up to. And speaking of Catwoman, she is undoubtedly the major highlight of this movie. I would say the last three movies were really the Talia trilogy, so it's kind of refreshing to get something different. And Catwoman, like the thief that she is, steals the spotlight. I find this performance to be pretty good. I think the character here comes off as more woman than cat. You get a feel for the persona, but this movie is really focused on showing you the person. I think she's more open, honest, and vulnerable than a lot of the other Catwoman performances. Mainly because the story takes place in a point where she's attempting to make things work with Bruce. She's putting her image aside to let her humanity take center stage. And in response, Bruce is also trying to shed his rough exterior. It's kinda sweet and also tragic watching these two desperately try to meet each other halfway and manage to get torn apart when they realize they couldn't. My biggest issue with this movie is that while there are things done well here, they're the same things that were done well, and I would even argue done better in the previous couple movies. Overall, I like this movie substantially less than I like the ones that came out before it, but I have a really hard time having the same appreciation for this, because I don't like it when it's following the original story, and I don't like it when it's trying to do its own thing. Despite that, I don't think it's terrible. There are definitely a lot of elements that work to this movie that I would say make it worth the watch. And I could very well see other Batman fans enjoying themselves. I'm just not one of them. I would recommend checking this movie out for yourself to make your own opinion, because I don't think the movie's necessarily bad by any means, it's just bad for me. So with all that being said, if you didn't think this video was bad, and you want to see me talk about the Justice League movies that are attached to this, let me know in the comment section below by leaving a comment saying,
Hush, hush.
I was your least favorite YouTuber, Infuso, and I thank you for watching. Hope to see you in the next one.
I am vengeance. I am the night, and that was Infuso. Just remember, if you're not tuning in, then you're missing out.
So, if you like the words that came out of his mouth hole, and you too would like to become a V-generate, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, nerds!
And if you're not joining the fun, you're in for one bad day. And you know what they say about having one bad day?
Catch him next time. Same bat time. Same bat channel.